Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
James Madison's constitutional consistency, his theoretical consistency or philosophical consistency, is primarily a question of whether he changed from the period in the 1780s when he was thought to be a strong nationalist and modest Republican to the period of the 1790s in which he was thought to be less strongly nationalist but far more strongly Republican. But that's an oversimplification, it seems to me. When Madison began his educational career at the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, he imbibed several strains of theoretical interest, one of which was a strong commitment to republicanism, to be sure, but perhaps still more importantly was a strong commitment to religious liberty. He was influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment, by his mentor Witherspoon and others. And in the course of developing his ideas, he entered into a political career in a certain way, seeking to realize the promise of those ideas he had acquired. He began them in association largely with Thomas Jefferson, and as they pursued the Virginia statement of constitutional principles, the Declaration of Rights in Virginia. One of the interesting things that emerged was his commitment to defeating the word toleration in reference to religious liberty, because he argued it is not to be a matter of toleration that people are free in their conscience. It is a right in and of itself. Well, that commitment comes forward in 1785 by the time he is challenging in the Virginia legislature through his memorial and remonstrance a proposal to impose an assessment, a tax really, on citizens in Virginia to support religious establishments. And he thought this was inappropriate. And he argues against it in such a way as to establish what I think is an overlooked expression of his theoretical principles, the ones that subsequently will be developed in his essays for the Federalists, in his arguments in the Constitutional Convention, and in his politics of the 1790s. In other words, I'm suggesting I don't think there's a problem of inconsistency in James Madison. There is a phenomenon of changing political circumstances calling forth rearticulations, re-expressions of political principles and adapting them to particular contexts. But I don't think there's a problem of inconsistency. I think he was, in fact, consistent. And we see this certainly late in his life when he recurs to questions of constitutional interpretation. And he has created a defensible posture for arguing what constitutes a legitimate foundation for constitutional interpretation. Madison had opposed in 1791 the proposal for a Bank of the United States as unconstitutional. By the time he leaves the presidency in 1817, he has approved the Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States. And that's one of the things people point to that suggest he was inconsistent. He argues he wasn't inconsistent. He argues he was wrong in 1791, and he was demonstrated wrong by the subsequent history, and therefore he embraces what had been established by those who ratified the Constitution and those who were engaged in the deliberations about it as the definitive view of what the true understanding of the Constitution was. So I think Madison we should think of as someone who thought through issues with the underlying commitment to republicanism and especially religious liberty as the foundation, and therefore was consistent throughout in his political theory. His Hamilton-Jefferson relationship is one that's probably inexplicable even today. We know many things about it, so I don't mean to say, when I say inexplicable, that we don't know the facts. What we don't know are some of the fundamental sentiments. We know that Madison and Jefferson were very close. They were intimate friends. To some degree, we may say Madison followed Jefferson's lead with respect to certain political commitments. But he didn't quite follow him philosophically, theoretically. In fact, as often as not, Madison provided the lead for Jefferson in thinking through problems of politics and philosophical expression. But they became such close partners, such close allies, that their entire careers, starting from the period when in the 1780s they became associated in fighting for reform in the Virginia Constitution and in the Virginia laws, all the way through the end of the presidency of James Madison, who succeeded to Thomas Jefferson, they remained close, dedicated allies. Their relationship was unshakable. Whereas with Alexander Hamilton, we have a period of collaboration between Madison and Hamilton, beginning with their service in the Confederation Congress, when what they were doing was laboring to invigorate and strengthen the Confederation so that it would be adequate to the purposes of union, so that it would have the ability to acquire revenues and the ability to engage in diplomatic conversations with some degree of authority. So they were collaborators, but they were never close friends. When in 1787, in the Constitutional Convention, they worked toward the same end, they were collaborators, but not close friends. When Hamilton recruited Madison to co-author the Federalist Papers, they were collaborators, but not quite friends. One illustration of this occurs on June the 6th in the Constitutional Convention. That's where Madison gives a lengthy speech which becomes, in effect, the preliminary statement of his argument about factions, which is published in Federalist number 10, the very famous argument about the extended republic and his defense of the extended republic as a defense against faction as opposed to a small republic. Alexander Hamilton, on that day in his notes about Madison's speech, makes the observation, it isn't all he thinks it is. There's something to it, but it's not complete. And that's just perhaps an expression of what their relationship was like. There were some things that they were in sync about, but not completely in sync. So when in the 1790s, Madison moves in opposition to Hamilton, opposes Hamilton's program for the Bank of the United States, opposes the program for the assumption of state debts, opposes the proposal for the support of manufacturing, and other such things throughout the course of the 1790s. And they become such partisan opponents that they seem to be really almost at one another's throats, you might imagine. It's only an expression of that area in which, though they were collaborators, they were not wholly in agreement theretofore, that there was something always missing in the interaction between Madison and Hamilton. And that missing thing was what Madison found in Jefferson. So it led them in different directions. But interestingly enough, while Hamilton and Jefferson became mutually antagonistic and never accommodated one another to the point of forming a respectful appreciation for the other, Madison and Hamilton remained respectful of one another to the end. Hamilton refused to simply reject Madison as dishonest, and Madison, to the end of his life in 1836, was still defending Hamilton's integrity. So it is a curious set of relationships among these founding fathers, where if we look only at the politics, we think we can find only an adversarial posturing. When we look deeper, we find an intellectual engagement is the fundamental tenor of the relationship. And there is a degree of moral commitment added to that, which gives fuller expression to the relationship between Madison and Jefferson. One can never, in a brief compass, explain James Madison's political philosophy. And that's because it is itself an elaborate construction. Madison was a committed Republican. He didn't become a Republican under the influence of Thomas Jefferson the way some have imagined. He was a Republican from his days in college forward. But Republicanism to him meant something more than what it had meant in the tradition of political philosophy. In the tradition, it meant small states where people interact face to face, know one another, and engage in common decision making. But Madison had come to realize that there was a fundamental instability in that small state expression of the Republican or Democratic life. And that what really was required was to give people enough exposure to the diversity of interest and faculties without surrendering to the rule of a mere faction, that they would give each other space to develop their particular interest, concerns, or needs. And therefore the large republic argument, the extended republic argument became for Madison the cornerstone of his political philosophy. But it was a political philosophy that also recognized that you still needed to make structural accommodations. So he tells us in Federalist 51 that there are auxiliary precautions to assure Republican safety in the government. And those have to do with checks and balances, separation of powers. They have to do with the split between state and national government, or state and federal as we now say. All of these things become part of the picture. In other words, it takes an architecture, a complex architecture, to create the framework of liberty to sustain republicanism in James Madison's point of view. But he would still argue that once you put this elaborate structure together, it is a government that is wholly popular. It is not merely popular because there's built into it safeguards against unjust majority rule. Because that proved to be the gravest danger. The danger wasn't how to prevent aristocracy, how to prevent minority faction, because the majority could outvote the minority. The danger was how to prevent majority faction. And you can only do this through a very complex set of political interactions that had the effect of teasing out the claims, the excessive claims of political interest or economic interest, so that they wouldn't ride roughshod over the whole society. His political philosophy, therefore, was to make the operation of political society itself the basis for restraining, limiting the ambitions of political society, and thus avoiding the opportunities for, the openings for misrule, unjust rule. He said, justice is the end of civil society, always has been and always will be, and it will always be pursued, even if it costs liberty in the end. Justice is the end of civil society. So that was his political philosophy. It was to find a structure that would give expression to justice. I tend to call James Madison a democratic nationalist, meaning largely that he sees it as possible to express the democratic principle, if not the democratic practice, in a large national context. So nationalism for America means, for him, government which is constrained by democratic sentiments. That is going to require being responsive from the federal level to the expression of state interest. It's necessary. Even in the Constitutional Convention, when they were debating what the government would look like, James Madison was the person who introduced the question of distinct interest in the states in order to dislodge the small state, large state conflict. and try to move the convention on. Subsequently, in his political participation in 1798, 99, for example, when they were contending against the Alien and Sedition laws, he writes the Virginia Resolution and the Virginia Reports, which establish a role for the expression of constitutional understanding at the state level. Now, by 1832, he's being called upon by John C. Calhoun and others as a founder of a theory called nullification, which he did not use that term in his productions in 1798, 1799. But he then turns around and rebuts their claim that he was a nullifier. He does not argue that the states have, in effect, a right of secession, or the states can veto the acts of the federal government, but he does argue that the states have a voice, have a role, and need to be taken into account. Now, what this expresses is his underlying commitment to the authority of public opinion. And there was a conflict early in the United States over the question of how is public opinion expressed. Some thought it is expressed in elections, that when the people vote for representatives, what the representatives say is public opinion, because that's what the people have approved. But Madison, and Jefferson with him, took the position that the public opinion is always authoritative, not just in elections, but constantly. And so if public opinion is manifest in between elections, it should be as binding on the government as it is expressed in an election. And it is finding a way to articulate that public opinion in between elections. That's part and parcel of what Madison was doing in 1798 and 1799. That's what he means by American nationalism. He means by engaging the expression of public opinion, rising from the units, the organized units of the society, finding expression through whatever vehicles are there for the purpose, and bringing them to bear on the constituted authorities. If we had a prime minister in the United States, it would look like James Madison in the first Congress of the United States. Because remember, nobody knew what to do. Yes, they had had experience in colonial assemblies. They had experience in the initial state legislatures. All these people had some political background. But the new Congress was a new experience. It didn't look like the Confederation Congress. It had greater powers, authorities, jurisdiction. How to accomplish what? How should Congress be organized? What should be the rules of debate? How should you make a decision? Yes, you might use majority rule in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, but how do you pull it all together? All of this had to be constructed from scratch. And James Madison led that process in the House of Representatives. James Madison was the one who was there to propose most of the major legislation that was moving through the initial Congress. James Madison oversaw the most important contribution, introducing the amendments to the Constitution that became the Bill of Rights. And when he signaled his intention to introduce those amendments, there were some members of the House who said, "Oh, don't bother us with that. We have important work to do. We have a tariff to pass. We have to organize all the major departments of government. We have the military to consider how it should be organized. Why bother us with those amendments?" And he insisted that this was to be responsive to the will of the people who had ratified the Constitution, because they ratified upon the condition, the promise that they would be given a Bill of Rights, and good faith required it. So he led them in that, as he led them in organizing the departments. He led them in organizing the Department of the Treasury. His was the primary contribution. He led them in organizing the Department of State and the other offices of what became the cabinet of the president. So James Madison was the go-between between the president and the legislature, the Congress. He was the prime minister. There's no other way to say it. He was the person on the spot. He was the person whom everyone else looked to as having an authoritative voice on the direction that the country should take. And there's one other element that must be taken into account here. Fisher Ames is the one, among others, who made this kind of observation in the first Congress, namely that Madison came with a reputation from having been a prime mover in the Constitutional Convention, i.e., he brings into the Congress the authority to speak to the question of what it is the Congress should be doing in light of the Constitution. So yes, James Madison, I would submit, without his leadership, it would be highly questionable how effectively the government would have been organized at the outset. Madison's political career is such an interesting and complex web of varying tendencies. He, of course, is the first truly professional politician in the United States. He never had any other career. Yes, of course, he had the family estate, the family farm, and there was a couple of years he spent there tending to that in the distant way in which one tends to that when everybody else is doing all the work. But he was a professional politician, and he understood himself to be committed to public service, which meant that he often was in the position of making pragmatic judgments, pragmatic commitments and decisions. This is most of all manifest in his presidency. As Secretary of State, he of course was carrying out the objectives of the Jefferson administration, working in partnership with Jefferson, providing leadership to be sure, but nevertheless, it was Jefferson's agenda. And this shows up particularly when we adopt the policy of trying to avoid war in Europe, because British, French, other wars are constantly going on, as they had been going on for the past 15, 20 years. And Jefferson adopted a policy of embargo. So if we can't get them to leave us alone, then we will leave them alone. They can't send anything in here, we won't send anything out there. Our ships won't be prey on the oceans. We'll stay free of their entanglements. That embargo policy was inherited by Madison, and it failed. It failed to keep the United States out of war, which we know from the War of 1812, but it failed also because it didn't sufficiently establish protection for American commercial interest and created tensions within the society that were difficult to manage. Well, Madison therefore sets out in his administration having to change course on policies that he had helped with Jefferson to put into place in the first place. He continued in his administration having to come to terms with the realization that politics couldn't simply follow theoretical propriety. So he ends up having to go to Congress to lead the United States into war in 1812, against all intention and all purpose. But pragmatically, he had no choice. Similarly, he had to approve the Second Bank of the United States because it was a thing the country needed, particularly in the aftermath of the war when there was some need to establish stability in currency and in the system for handling debt in the United States. And he therefore approved it against the background previously of having thought it unconstitutional. So there are a series of such decisions that were necessary, that had to be made, that we can call pragmatic because they occur in context in which it seems that one is almost compelled. But I would never go so far as to say they are merely pragmatic. I think Madison always accepted the obligation to defend his conduct on principle. Always. That was perhaps the most consistent aspect of his life, that he would, whether privately or publicly, give a defense in principle of what he'd done, so that even if it entailed adaptation or change, he would still be there to defend it. One of the areas in which you will find this to be perhaps most problematic, and yet another way most informative, is to recognize that on the question of slavery, James Madison came to the conviction that slavery was wrong. He expressed this in the Constitutional Convention, in the First Congress of the United States. He celebrated the limitation on the foreign slave trade to be put in place in 1808 as an expression of the country's sentiment with regard to the inhumanity of slavery. So he came to the conviction that slavery was wrong, but James Madison was a slaveholder, and he never freed his slaves. He had friends and associates, Governor Cole, who took his slaves, freed them, and Madison praised him for it, though he doubted whether it was altogether wise. Now, why did he doubt that it was altogether wise to free the slaves? I said he always defended his principles. He became convinced that slavery was wrong. Why was he not certain slaves should be freed? Madison came to the conviction that the prejudice of color was ineradicable in the United States. And he thought, therefore, that there was no way whatever there could be peaceful existence between the slaves and the slaveholders in the United States, between blacks and whites. And therefore, he could not see any way to enter into a process of trying to establish relationships that could only eventuate in destruction and disorder. So for the same reason, he became a president of the Colonization Society. He sought to advance a form of abolition which was conditioned upon removing the freed, the manumitted slaves from the country, or at least far enough away from the settled portion of the country that there would be no interaction between the two peoples. So that's another example where his principles are clear, but the context in which you have to apply them can be difficult and complex and force you into decisions that aren't necessarily, from an abstract point of view, considered ideal.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.